The Keystone Pipeline would transport synthetic crude oil from Canada to refineries along the Gulf Coast. But the pipeline has not been without its critics. And in December, Congress gave the Obama administration a 60-day deadline to make a decision about the project. In January, President Obama rejected the application, stating that the deadline for the decision had prevented a full assessment of the pipeline's impact. Tonight, what does all of this mean for the project, for the energy industry, and for our region? I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston 8. Joining us tonight are Dr. Michelle Foss, Bureau of Economic Geology, University of Texas at Austin; Dr. Jeffrey Wozniak, Texas Research Institute for Environmental Studies, Sam Houston State University; and Dr. Don Van Nieuwenhuise, Director of Petroleum Geo-science Programs, University of Houston. Before we start, remember you can share your thoughts throughout the show on Twitter using hashtag Houston8. And welcome back to all of you. You were with us quite a bit last year, and we've got you back again today.
Yes.
First place I want to start, when we did the open of this, all of the crew, we were all discussing the term synthetic crude oil. And I'll start with you, Dr. Don. What are we talking about that's going into this pipeline?
The product that's going into the pipeline actually is produced from bitumen, which naturally occurs in these rocks in the Athabasca oil sands. And what they do is they actually mix it with water and heat it so that it's mobile, and then they start to process it. They initially pull a froth off, and then they start to break down the hydrocarbon chains from the long hydrocarbon chains to byproducts that have shorter hydrocarbon chains and are lighter and less viscous.
And so it is different than just crude oil,
right.
Synthetic crude oil, and it's lighter so it can move through the pipeline?
Right. It comes from a natural product, but it's broken down into different components and then remixed into components that are less viscous and easier to transport. So it's not thick bitumen that they're trying to put through the pipeline.
Okay.
They actually break it down into what we call naphtha, and then there's gas oil, and then also something very similar to diesel is mixed together. What they take out of the bitumen is some elements like nitrogen and sulfur, and they store those, and then they put in hydrogen to help stabilize some of the new molecules that they make, and that way they build basically the components of a good crude oil, but it's synthetic.
Okay, Michelle, let me ask you a question. Here comes your government question for me. Let's see how you can do on this one. Congress gives the president 60 days to make a decision, and then his answer to that 60-day make a decision is, I'm just not going to decide.
Pretty much.
So how does that work? I mean, what is his right to do that?
Well, there are actually some legal questions about whether or not he really was maybe stepping out of bounds a little bit, considering that the authority to cite the pipeline, rightly or wrongly, lies with the State Department. The State Department was following all of the bullets of things that it's supposed to do by law and had basically cleared the pipeline. And so then the politics start with regard to whether or not it's going to go forward. And let me point out, this is kind of an unusual thing. And one of the things that is actually happening right now is an attempt to take that authorization away from the State Department. We have an agency called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And the FERC, the FERC, has an Office of Energy Projects. And that OEP office, that OEP group, is responsible for citing all of the other oil and gas pipelines around the United States. But somehow the State Department ended up with authority for pipelines that cross international boundaries. And you could argue about whether or not, it makes sense to have a State Department involved in that sort of thing. But there are no people with experience. There's not a group that's set up to deal with things like this, to get environmental impact assessments done, to review information, to work with the project proponents, to deal with the stakeholders or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So what I think we actually have is a logical consequence of a bit of bad organization in U.S. government, and if what comes out of this is a mechanism for fixing that and then getting major projects like this housed in an organization that knows how to deal with the conflicts and the issues, the technical information, and all of that kind of stuff, that would be a big improvement. maybe this is a tough lesson that will trigger that.
Well, let me go to Jeffrey on this then. Is it a bad thing that the president says, you know what, I just think this is rushed. We don't have enough time to know the impact this is going to have?
Is it a bad thing? No. Maybe some people say yes, but from an environmental point of view, I would just like to see due diligence be done. And if you look at the process, going back to 2008, it's been fairly extensive. They've been doing a lot of assessments, a lot of public hearings, thousands and tens of thousands of pages of documentation about the environmental impact. In reading the 10,000-page document, as I'm sure Don and Michelle also did, it's extensive, and they do go through a lot of details in understanding the potential impacts. So.
But this isn't the first time we have built a pipeline. It isn't the first pipeline that has crossed borders. Why is this one getting this kind of attention? And I'll throw this out to any of you.
That's really a kind of a strange question, but in the sense that it's not an atypical pipeline. It's not something that we haven't done before. What's really unusual just seems to be that everyone's focused against petroleum products as being used for energy. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I kind of see it. It just seems to be, it's just a completely dirty business, and we want to stay away from it. And I think everybody in the business is leaning towards trying to come up with cleaner alternatives like natural gas, for example, and that sort of thing. But the actual energy demands that we have in our country and around the world require that we use liquid hydrocarbons. And one of the best things about liquid hydrocarbons for energy is that, we can transport it through a pipeline. It is mobile. It can be stored. You can't store electricity. You have to, put it in very expensive batteries, which are an environmental issue in the first place and on their own. And then when you transmit electrical power, you lose energy. When you transmit oil, you're not losing any energy at all doing it.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, you were nodding a few moments ago.
Well, I think that Don is exactly correct. I don't think this has anything to do with the pipeline, and I think it has everything to do with every other thing out there. And we talked about some of this when we did the Macondo series. I think Jeff made a critical point. 3 years, 2008, I don't know how long it takes to study what is a piece of equipment, a facility, an infrastructure that we have thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of already. And so it's not going to perform a function that's any different than any other function we perform. It happens that at the starting end of it is a product that people oppose and that has become something of a lightning rod for the fossil fuels industry going forward. What Don referred to, or you referred to as synthetic crude, which I think of as heavy oil, which comes from the Athabasca oil sands deposit, which is enormous in Canada, is something that is like a line in the sand for a lot of people, and literally a line in the sand. And so this and again, because I think it's been housed in the State Department, which is not well equipped to deal with these kinds of things. I think it was a logical play out, and it was very difficult for people to manage the different groups that began to coalesce.
Now, somewhere along the line, in all of our conversations that we've had, and it was either on air or off air, one of you said to me that even if we move forward and look for new alternative sources of energy, we still have an entire industry built on the old way of doing things. And you need to feed that while you develop the new. So to say cut off our oil supply, especially in this pipeline, it's not realistic. You can be moving forward while still maintaining what we have. Oh, you're just nodding away.
I'm just going to add one thing and then let Don and Jeff carry on, because here's the thing that everybody keeps missing. We produce and we move around the world and use something like 88 million barrels a day of oil, right? And then I don't know how many TCF of natural gas we use. But those two things together, hydrocarbons, make up about half of the energy that the world consumes in various forms. But what we never talk about are the materials. And so this infrastructure that needs to be fed isn't just there to provide energy products. It's there to provide something, if I had to guess, 75 to 80% of the raw materials that we use for everything. I mean, it's everything from the fibers in our clothes to the tabletop here to the composites that house your cameras. And to change that is not easy. And that is what it gets totally missed in conversations about projects like this, and what we do and how we live as human beings.
Jeffrey, bring us back around then, because in studying this, I hear this pipeline, in some versions of it, because they have alternate routes of it,
right,
but some went through some very important areas of our country for water source, for wildlife. What is the dangers of this pipeline?
Well, I think the easiest way to sort of understand the dangers, and dangers is an interesting word, but nevertheless, you have to look at time and space. So what are the short term, the long term, and then the possible permanent impacts? So through the construction phase, that would be short term. Things are going to be impacted in less than 3 years. So going in, construction equipment, actually removing topsoil to place it, digging the hole, the actual construction process. Many of those systems are going to be able to respond in a short-term time period, within 3 years. More of a long-term response might be in forested areas, where we actually go in and remove more larger vegetation. Those areas are going to take a longer-term time scale to respond. And potential long-term ones, or permanent ones, are going to be areas where you've got the actual footprint of pump stations along the line. You know, it's not just the pipeline that we're talking about. It's the different pump stations and the tank facilities in the central area.
And I come to this from not knowing as much about this area as the three of you do, but how different is this than building a highway or building some kind of construction? Is it just construction in general is bad, or is there something inherent in building a pipeline?
I think it's the same concerns are there as any construction process, and I think it goes back to what we said earlier, that I think it's this inherent fear of petroleum product being moved across the country. But many of the risks are the same.
Yeah.
And what you find with a highway is very similar. What you in essence are doing is fragmenting the habitat. And a highway is going to be a physical barrier to certain types of organisms, whereas this pipeline actually may be less of a physical barrier, because it's going to be buried, and it in many ways will be less intrusive.
Yeah.
You were going to say?
Yeah, well, a pipeline in general is probably one of the cleanest and greenest ways to move any kind of fuel.
Right. That was a good point that came out, that if they don't have the pipeline, they're going to put it in tankers, and they're going to bring tankers around, and we know the problems we can have with that.
2 days,
or railroads.
2 days of transmission in that pipeline is equal to the average tanker. So, do you want to have a lot of tankers out in the ocean on top of these other things? If we ship product out, there'll be tankers too. But at the same time, if you ship the crude oil somewhere else first and then ship the product out, then you can have all sorts of additional transportation footprints. But when you look at that very sensitive area, as a geologist, groundwater is real important to me, and the Ogallala aquifer, as it is, has a lot of threats to it.
And that feeds water to about 8 states, correct?
Yes, and it's one of the largest aquifers in the United States, and it actually is irrigating places that normally couldn't really sustain vegetation and therefore agriculture.
And let me take the jump that the thought is, if there is a leak along the pipeline in that area, then it could devastate that region.
No, it would. It could injure a small part of it, and that's already written into some of the contracts, that whatever damage is done will be remediated, whatever water is lost will be replaced. The pipeline is very small footprint compared to agricultural irrigation. Over-irrigation right now is the biggest danger to that aquifer, and it has been for a long time, and managing that process is a much bigger problem than one small pipeline. And there are, in fact, over 3,000 miles of hazardous pipelines already crossing that part of the aquifer in Nebraska. So it's kind of like a toothpick versus a baseball bat in terms of a problem.
So Jeffrey, I don't know that I understand exactly what the environmentalist concern is regarding this particular project, as opposed to just projects in general.
Well, I think the concern is it's a cautious concern. It's looking at potential impacts. We know certain things are going to happen, as we talked about with construction issues. Pipelines are a fairly safe way of moving oil around. There's parts of this pipeline that have been in place, and I think in the last calendar year there's only been 14 spills. I think around 10 of them were all less than about 20 gallons of oil. They weren't associated directly with the pipeline. They were at seals and fittings around pump houses and whatnot. So I don't necessarily view this as it's folks, waving the environmental flag saying we can't do this, because when you read the assessment, I do think it is thorough, and I do think that we are doing our best to understand what the potential impacts are. And it's in many cases looking at worst case scenarios. But I think that's the way to do it. I mean, look at the Macondo spill. We were in a worst case scenario situation. Having this background document and having the ability to know the potential impacts on everything from multiple habitat types, different ecoregions, a myriad of different plant and animal species gives you the power in the event of an issue to be able to act.
Now you're talking about the report, and there was an environmental analysis done by a Houston company, and that came under concern because the Trans-Canadian Oil group that is in charge of this pipeline are major clients of this firm that then went and did the report. Is this the same report we're talking about, or is this a different report?
I was referring to the Department of State's environmental impact statement.
Okay.
There were subcontracts nested within that master report done by different companies. Michelle can probably speak to the economic reports that have been done. There's been talk of increased job growth, others saying, well, it won't be as grand as what we might think it is. So every report seems to have a contradictory report on the other side.
So let's bring it closer to home then and ask, so the pipeline right now is stalled, and there's workarounds that they're trying to figure out.
Actually, it's not. And to a point,
Okay.
to Don's point, and your conversation earlier about moving that oil by tanker, the irony in this is that you can't move that oil by tanker unless you build a pipeline in Canada, because this oil
And there already is a pipeline.
in the middle
This
of
is an extension, isn't it?
No, what the Canadians are doing as we speak is going through an environmental review to build a westbound pipeline to carry that oil to the Pacific coast so that it can actually get into world markets. Because if it's not going to come into the marketplace via the lower 48, our country, then it will remain landlocked without some kind of access. And so that's the process that they're going through, and so far it actually looks fine. There is a lot that has to be done in order to get Northern Gateway, that pipeline system, off the ground.
So talk about then what it means to our region if in fact they go other routes. If it doesn't come into the Texas area, what happens to us?
There are two consequences. But petroleum markets are complex in terms of where crude oil comes in to the refining complexes around the country, not just here on the Gulf Coast, but on the East Coast and so on, West Coast, and upper Midwest and so on. One of the things about the whole system was that it was going to provide access for crude oil being produced from our own fields. So we're having a boom, a revival in oil production in places like North Dakota and the Bakken Shale and in the South Texas, in the Eagle Ford, and this entire system was actually going to debottleneck a lot of that production, especially North Dakota, and help us get that crude oil into the marketplace, which would provide more competitive sources of raw material for refining and some competition in the gasoline market, which we haven't had, and various things like that. So it's not just a question of direct jobs and whether or not and how many. A major project creates jobs. I mean, there's no doubt about that. What it has implications for is the broader economy and the cost of energy to the overall economy, and that's much more important than just the very narrow conversation about this project itself and the economics of this project.
Yeah, it creates access to a much larger source of oil on our own continent that will be transported much more cheaply, more cost-effective, as you're pointing out, and basically it's given us more access to the product that we need.
See, now some critics will say that's a fallacy, that they bring it into this area, they refine it here so that they can load it onto tankers and send it off into the rest of the world, so that the impact locally... Okay, Michelle?
Because, I mean, this is so complicated, but you keep peeling the onion, and this is one thing that has been pointed out actually by a colleague of mine recently, and which is something that anybody who looks at marine transportation in the United States knows. We have something called the Jones Act. And the Jones Act requires that if you're going to ship something using marine transportation in U.S. waters from point to point in our country, that you have to have American-built ships and American crews. And we don't have either of those things because we have basically outsourced the marine transportation business. And so the problem of whether or not after building this pipeline it comes to the Gulf Coast refineries and boom, we're just sending it out to the rest of the world could be fixed if everybody would be willing to revisit the Jones Act and either repeal it because it's outdated or modify it, or something like that, so that you can ship that product into our own markets and benefit from it.
So, Dr. Allen, we can't right now ship it out then?
We won't. I mean,
we can't ship all of it.
We don't do that. You would have to rejig the entire marine transportation business so that we're building tankers, we're crewing tankers. We just don't do that anymore. We're not competitive in that business.
So then, what should be the concerns for those of us in this area in hearing about all of this? Why are we so up in arms about this pipeline? Is it simply the jobs? Is it that it would have lowered gas prices, the oil prices? What do you see as the big hot button issue on this?
Actually, I would say all of the above, but because again, when you have better access to cheaper sources of hydrocarbons, it's just going to help economically across the board. You're going to produce, you'll have increased production here, and a lot of the products that are produced here will be shipped by pipelines we already have in place to the north, and the link from Cushing to Houston is going to help us transport stuff again to the north, and so there's a lot of and also products from, as she was pointing out, some of the oil shales in the United States can hop onto these pipelines too and come down to Houston and be refined down here.
Yeah.
And what they already have available is helping get oil to the refineries that are in the middle west, in the Chicago area, the Illinois area, and that sort of thing, and that's helping them a lot too. So this whole overarching product of a pipeline and the XL pipeline really are a huge benefit, and to oppose it is almost baffling because a lot of the concerns overlook the fact that we have thousands of miles of pipeline already, that we're moving lots of product already. And
yeah. Well, I was just going to say, you said, to oppose or to approve. I think the trick of it is some people are, definitely for it. Some people are definitely against it. And I think you have to somewhere find yourself in the middle. Sure. You have to be able to understand there are potential environmental impacts. You have to address those. But there are economic gains. There are ways we can do a better job of moving this petroleum product around. So I think it's difficult to sort of sometimes maybe lay down your allegiances to certain beliefs. I think in this country as a society, we tend to be Team A or Team B. And God forbid there's some gray area in the middle where you might be able to say, well, maybe it could be this or that. And
yeah, it's a balancing act.
Yeah. And that's what we do as scientists. We try to ask questions, collect data, and let the data speak to answer and or support the hypotheses that we ask. So.
Now, I know we are running out of time, but there is one other area I wanted to jump into, and I don't know if we have enough time to do it justice or not, but the whole eminent domain argument about where the pipeline is going, and I guess it would affect 34 families or regions in the state of Texas alone. Who decide where the pipeline is going to go through that they can take up that property? How does that fit into all of this? When we're talking about building a for-profit pipeline for a company, where does eminent domain come in? Who has the right to decide whether that property can be pulled or not? Well, and I have 2.5 minutes for that topic to be addressed.
When it comes to building critical infrastructure, the first thing that happens is you go out and you work with the landowners, the property owners, along whatever you think the most efficient route is. And the first rule of thumb is you're going to pick the most efficient route. You're going to build it in a geographic pattern that is least cost, hopefully, to the facility.
But they have proposed a series of different routes.
They've proposed some different routes, and actually TransCanada is continuing to work on an alternative route to avoid any piece of the Ogallala, and is still running into opposition. By law, and it varies, but again, by law, if people object and aren't willing to negotiate, and it's going to disrupt an entire facility that otherwise is deemed to be of interest, then eminent domain kicks in, and the landowners are still compensated, but they're not compensated as much probably as if they would negotiate in the first place. Mm-hmm. And this is used, in the United States, in Canada, to actually get things done. And we use it for everything. We use it for roadways, pipelines, everything.
And a lot of this land is farm and agricultural land and whatnot, and those farmers are compensated for their loss, especially during the construction phase. And
I will
oftentimes-
clarify, too, that it's 34 cases are up against TransCanada by Texas landowners.
not
And the
just
main
34.
argument is
Not
that
more than that
TransCanada...
Well, I mean, it's not just 34 houses in total.
Right, yeah,
That's
it's
right.
34
It's 34
actions.
different actions.
Yeah.
And what people are arguing is that in TransCanada's case, it's a foreign company. And so therefore, to exercise the same eminent domain laws for a foreign entity, regardless of the fact that TransCanada has operated in the United States for a long time and has all sorts of businesses here, I mean, that's what people are using as a lever against the project.
Don, in the 30 seconds we have left, actually 20 now, are we going to see this pipeline completed? What do you think?
I hope that the political pressure gets put on it and that it does get completed. I couldn't bet that it will get done, but I can't imagine why it wouldn't get done.
5 seconds left. What do you two think? Done, not done? Is it going to happen?
I think within the next 5 years. That's my time window.
I think as the Canadians get more real on a Pacific route, people down here will figure out how
And
to
we
get
are
it done.
out of time. Thank you all for joining us. Remember, each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org/Houston8. There you can read more about the guests, learn more about the topic, and even watch past episodes. Next week on Houston 8, with the news of Houston becoming home for Anglicans and Episcopalians who want to join the Roman Catholic Church, we'll explore the ever-evolving world of the church, why some people choose to leave and why others join in. That's next Friday night at 8 p.m. right here on Channel 8. And that does it for us tonight. Until next time, I'm Ernie Manous. Thank you for watching.